What over here?
Jeff.
All right. Right on time. What a wonderful turnout. I want to thank everyone for coming today for the launch of the Village of Cayuga Heights Centennial Celebration. This is the first in a series of talks leading up to the historic Ithaca house tour and other events in June, when we will officially celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Village of Cayuga Heights. In my wildest dreams, I didn't think we'd get a room full like this between the snowstorm and the Super Bowl. I'm not sure that most of us have conflicts with the Super Bowl, but
I only have an hour to stay here. I will just take that.
just an hour, okay.
I do. I got conflicts.
So some people, even with conflicts, manage to get themselves here. So thank you all for coming out. I'm Kate Supron. I'm the mayor in the Village of Cayuga Heights. I'm actually introducing today, stepping in for our village historian, Bea Zeckley, who is the woman who has pulled all of this together for us. Bea, most unfortunately, fell earlier in the week and is recovering from her fall and couldn't be here today. So I was going to come anyway, but I wouldn't have been up here introducing. I also want to thank our two historic preservationists, Randy Capex and Carol Shipman in the back, who have also worked very hard with Bea Zeckley to pull together this series and the history project for the village. We're thrilled today to have Carol Sisler here with us. Carol is the author of Enterprising Families, the authoritative history of prominent 19th and 20th century Ithaca families. Her book treats in detail the initial development of Cayuga Heights. As a former historian of the village, as well as the director of Historic Ithaca, Carol will talk about the changing architectural history of the Heights. Her work provided the new Historic Preservation Committee with the bones to create the History Project, which you will hear more about in the coming months. Her book has been an indispensable resource for the development of the new Village of Cayuga Heights history website, which is packed with information gleaned from her incredibly comprehensive research. I believe we have boxes of the cards here with the History Project website on it. If you haven't gotten one of those, please do pick one up. And if you haven't yet visited the website, I encourage you to do so, because it's really an impressive piece. I think that's enough from me, and I will turn it over to Carol.
Thank you. Here, so we'll have a very informal talk about Cayuga Heights. I said I'd introduce myself, so my relationship to Cayuga Heights began in 1958 when my husband and I and our one-year-old son came to Cornell for him to do his work on his PhD. At the time in the newspaper there was the ad for 3 apartments available, one of whom we took on Triphammer Lane, where Dave Barr lives now today, still I think. And it was in a terrace apartment. And what I remember about that was the pheasants that used to come across the road out of the woods, just whatever direction, I know it was southeast of us, west of us. And of course we don't see them anymore, but they were there prominently. Every day we could see them. Well then, as my husband was offered a position at Cornell, we decided to buy a house, to look for a house, and we went out with Ann Warren of Warren Real Estate, and she's, a petite woman, and here she had this great big Cadillac that she would take us to drive. You won't remember that. And the thing she told us was, well, those professors who live in Cornell Heights always have a second income, meaning that Cornell pay well enough to maintain the housing in the Heights. I don't know. Anyway. But we decided to buy a house in the Bryant Park area on the other side of Cornell. But our friends all bought houses here, like the Alleys bought a house on Oak Hill Road. And the Brumsteads bought a house on White Park Road. And Dave and Mary Call bought a house on Comstock Road. So we came back and forth to Cayuga Heights quite a bit. But as we were planning this program for the centennial, we had a good time being, Carol and Randy and I, driving around the Heights, and I would say, oh, so-and-so lived there, and Randy would say, oh no, it's owned by so-and-so today. So I think many of you here are the third, maybe fourth generation of owners of these houses in the Heights. I think what's happened, of course, today is they probably all have new kitchens. That would be the first. And maybe additions of a family room or some of the other amenities that we like to have in our houses today. So we're going to turn our minds back to 1896. That's when Trip Hammer Bridge was constructed by Edward Wyckoff. He paid for it himself. And so Wyckoff, we know Wyckoff Road. That was Edward Wyckoff. His father developed the Remington typewriter. And so the wealth in that family came from that business. And he decided that he was going to develop, along with other leading businessmen in town, Cornell Heights. And Jared Newman was part of that development. So, this is Jared Newman and his wife Jane Williams Newman on their 50th wedding anniversary. That was very nice. Jared was, his name Treeman, of course we know the name Treeman, that was the family that settled in Trumansburg on their original military tract. And the Abner Treeman sons came into Ithaca, and they were the ones who developed the banks and many of the businesses, a big hardware store, and other elements in town. So he had the connection with the Treeman family, but more so his wife was a Williams, and the Williams family lived on West Hill, apparently where that armory building is, or whatever that military, or army outpost is on West Hill. They had a lovely big old Gothic revival house, and the father, Josiah Williams, was very interested in the development of the Erie Canal. So he had the business going back and forth to Ithaca from the Erie Canal down Cayuga Lake to Ithaca. But it was also involved in what's now Bank of America. I think it's the right name. It's gone through. It used to be First National, but it's gone through 3 or 4 iterations since then. So he had these two connections in town, and he was also on the board. There's one seat right here. I see some people coming looking through the door. He had the connections, the banking connections, so that when he decided, he'd been involved with the Cornell Heights development, so he looked farther north, but I worked through it anyway. Franklin Cornell owned a farm in this area, and just north of Cornell Heights, and so Jared Newman bought that property and decided to develop it into well, let's call it a high-class residential district. And his partner in the business was Charles Blood. Charles was about 10 years younger than Jared Newman, and the only son of General Blood. He served during the the DeWitt Guards, back just anyway in the early 1800s. Anyway, he thought that the family thought that Jared Newman would be a good influence on their son Charles. So the two of them began to develop Cayuga Heights. Jared Newman had already built a house in Cayuga Heights. They called it Clovermere. It's still in position. It's now at the corner of Iroquois and Highland Road. Luckily, it has been nicely renovated and restored. And Jared Newman's granddaughter, Peg Thomas, still is with us. She lives with me at Kendall. And she and I walked through this house one day. I think it was for sale. And anyway, we went through it with the realtor, and she was so wonderful because she could talk about her memories of being in that house. Her family lived in Pennsylvania, but she would come up here in the summers to stay with her grandparents. So, all right, so as I said, Newman had connections with the, leading people in town. So this is what the area, his Cornell, Cayuga Heights looked like, the beginning of Cayuga Heights, about 1910, 1912. So this was a house, this house on this side, it's alleged to be Gustav Stickley designed. I mean, they had the plans, they could use the plans, so anyway, but this was built by F.S. Peer. Jared Newman built this house, designed by Waltz and Gibb, and his brother-in-law, John Tanner, who was a mathematics professor at Cornell, married to a Williams daughter, built that house. So all those three houses are still with us. And he hired Harold Caparn to be a landscape architect in this area. And I'm almost wanting to say that this is the beginning of the parkway, and these are the pine trees that are still there. I hope that's the case, but I'm wanting to say that because I do know he did have the pine trees did have those planted to line the parkway. Newman was very, very interested, of course, in the terrain. You'll hear more about that from some of the other speakers in the lecture series. But of course, Cayuga Heights has this beautiful waterfalls that run through the property. And he was very interested in preserving the natural features of the area. So he started, let's see, in 1910, 1912. World War I comes, and of course, no construction. When the war ended, he decided to begin a big campaign to sell the lots. And so here's this ad for it. White Park Road is named for Andrew D. White, whom Newman considered his intellectual father. The Oak Hill Road was named as a matter of kind of competition. A number of people that were interested in building there. What do you want to name it? And so it was suggested Oak Hill Road. So those two areas were, he highly concentrated on selling those lots in those two areas. Then he also had to develop the roads. This was all at his own expense. And so let's talk a little bit about the naming of some of the roads in Cayuga Heights. As I mentioned, Trip Hammer is named that because of the Trip Hammer was part of the mill that was located in just below BB Lake. And there was a mechanism, whatever, with the Trip Hammer, and the went clank, 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 so Trip Hammer. Hanshaw Road is named for the Hanshaw family. And I think there are still little Greek Revival houses right here as you turn onto North Trip Hammer. The Klein family, you'll see their house in a minute. They were early settlers. Their house is next door here, built in 1829, the brick house. That's now the trust company office. Iroquois Road, of course, is named for the Indian tribe groups who lived in this area. Comstock Road was named for John and Anna Comstock, who were also friends of Jared and Jane Newman. He was a professor at Cornell. I mentioned Wyckoff Road. Highgate is named for an area in London where some of his relatives lived. Remington, I mentioned Remington, the typewriter, and Corson Place, Hiram Corson was another one of his professor friends. Warren Road was named for George Warren, who was a professor of agricultural economics, who was developed working with the gold standard during the Roosevelt administration. Lowell Place is a fairly new development, as we all know. Did any of you buy Iris from Professor Randolph? No. Yes, a couple of hands. Yeah. Lowell Place is named for Professor Randolph. His name was Lowell Randolph. And I don't know well, there are these places in Cayuga Heights where the soil is wonderful. And so that was the case up there above Sheldon Road, where he grew he hybridized them. He grew the most beautiful iris. So I can remember going there. Of course, now Frank Henshaw, the builder, acquired that property after Randolph died and developed several houses in that area. Another view, this is what I want to think is the Parkway, Parkway a little later. Of course, I think too, I was thinking about it this afternoon, all right, 1896. People were still traveling by horse and buggy, right, then? The automobile was just developed about, 1900, 1910. So how people moved around at that time was, in the Heights, to me, was really interesting. Of course, by now, we all travel by automobile. Sunset Park was Newman's favorite place in the area, and he did have a bench located overlooking that lovely view. And one of the professors at Cornell, the architect Leroy Burnham, built his house in that area, Sunset Drive, as well as several other houses in the area for his architectural clients. Now I mentioned the Klein House. There it is, and there's the community corners with nothing there. And it's interesting, in 1920, Eunice Cornell Taylor, she was the daughter of Franklin Cornell, whose father was Ezra. She and her husband had been living in New York City, and they decided to come back to Ithaca and be gentlemen farmers. So they bought this house and the surrounding property that had been part of what they call the Manning Farm. And they became gentlemen farmers. Eventually, she sold milk. They had a dairy outlet in Collegetown. It was called the Taylor Farm Dairy. So it's really remarkable that that house still stands. Well, then her sister, Dorothy, built this house, which is here. And so I said there were several bonanzas for me when I was doing this research. The first was Jared Newman's papers. There are 40 boxes, at least, of papers from Jared Newman in the Cornell archives. And I think it was his son Charles who preserved all those papers and organized them in such a way. I went through every box. It was just fascinating because Newman had so many different sides to him as an intellectual, as a community leader, finally as a businessman. I think he always wanted to be an entrepreneur and he wanted to make money. So those were all there. The second bonanza was when I was working on Enterprising Families. I looked around for the book designer and finally located Mary Scott. And so we were talking, and we got to the point of here with, Cornell and this house and so on. She said, I have some photographs of that house. Well, what turned out is, and this was like, this was 10, 12, 15 years ago, then this house was built in 1928. So she had negatives from 1928, which is from which this photograph is printed. She also has the plans for this building. We're trying to find Mary. We can't find her. If anyone knows where she is, because those papers, should come back here as part of that record. Well, what happened with the two sisters is, during the Depression, their financial situations became severe. And so the Scotts were in the brick house, and he was managing the farm for Eunice Taylor. Anyway, the two women made an agreement with the Scotts that the Scotts would take care of them until they died. which was 1947, in exchange for the use of this property. And so let me see that. Okay, so there is that, you know, there's their property. And finally, okay, so things, okay, Jared Newman died in 1937. And he was in severe financial straits by then. You see, because of course during the Roosevelt administration, there became these bank examiners. You know, as banks were failing, these bank examiners would come and look at all the books, you know, who owns this, who owns this. Well, when they looked at Jared Newman's, you know, situation, because he was a Williams, married to a Williams, he was able to just go to the bank and say, oh, I need this. You know, all right, they would give it to him, you know, with no security. Other than maybe some, you know, they knew he had the stock in the Cornell Heights Land Company. Well, here comes the Depression. Here come the bank examiners. He's in his 80s, and they're saying, you know, show us, how is this loan secured? How is this money secured? And he fought tooth and nail, you know, he just didn't know, you know, I don't want to be examined by it, I don't like these people, you know, I don't want to do this. It was really tough, and so when he died in 1937, in May of 1937, his debts were quite extensive. So in September of 1937, at the corner of Midway Road and Triphammer, there was a big tent erected, and all the lots in the Midway, Northway, that area were at auction, and the average sale price was $600. So my second bonanza was meeting up with Peg McPherson. Her father-in-law, Andrew McPherson, built almost all the houses in the Heights as well as houses in the city of Ithaca. And I was talking with her, and out she brings this album, photo after photo after photo. All the houses that Andrew McPherson built with the name of the client and the name of the architect. I mean, it was just a goal. So I had the album photocopy each of the photos. And so there is now a complete set of those photographs as part of the history collection here. So
It's
if
on the
you have a
website.
house,
On the History Project website.
if you have a house in that region or want to know more about it, the photos are here. So I said, I just couldn't believe it, but you just never know when you go out and start talking with people, you know what you'll come up with. Okay, now we're after World War II. And one of the first things that Jared Newman had always planned to have a commercial district in this area, on the outskirts of what we would call the old Cayuga Heights. And so Walter Heasley and his wife and Sherwood Holt was the architect for these plans for the first building at Community Corners. And so as you can see how this has always been the commercial area for the Heights. And this is what Newman had always planned, and he had always thought, he realized that, he realized that younger couples couldn't live at the standard that he lived in. I mean, he had a chauffeur, you know, probably several housekeepers and a cook and so on. When Charles married and built his house on the Parkway, he told his father, you know, we can't live at the same standard that you lived in, and that his wife would do the housework and so on. So he accepted the fact that these smaller houses would be built in this area. Okay. Now, we're getting to the other brick house on North Triphammer. Some people think this was the original Savage farmhouse. It is not. It was built, I mentioned the Manning farm. So when one of Manning's daughters married a man named LaBar, and Manning delineated this property, took a piece of his property, gave it to LaBar, and this house was built. The Savage farmhouse is this one. Well, you know, of course, it was located at 706 Hanshaw Road. It's been completely renovated. I've seen pictures of it in its original shape. Dr. Ensworth, if you know Dr. Ensworth, when he was in the 1940s, he'd just come to Ithaca to establish his medical practice, and then he had to go into the military. And but I had the opportunity to talk with him at Kendall, and he told us that behind that yellow house, there's a wonderful pond. I don't know. I hope if some of you have walked that area. And so he told me, he said, well, one of the last things I did was I fenced in that pond so that there wouldn't be any problem with, children falling in. What happened was with the Savages is Elmer Seth Savage was a professor of animal husbandry at Cornell, and he wanted to do some special experiments in developing animal feed that would cause the beef animals, put on more weight more quickly. And this was just at the beginning of World War I. And so he acquired the property, and his father, asked his father to come, John Savage, to come. And so John lived in this house and managed the farm for his son, Seth, who was still working at Cornell. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is sort of talk about completing the development of Cayuga Heights. In 1932, the Pinewood section was developed. In 1928, the Berkshire area was developed. That's 14 lots. In 1930, Comstock Road was completed. In 1931, the parkway was extended to Kleinwoods and Hanshaw. In 1932, Forest Drive was completed. In 1932 to 33, Hampton Terrace was developed by Charles Blood. So those were so now we're up to World War II. Of course, things again did not progress much until after the war. The community corners, the building I showed you, was built in 1946. The Lakeland homes on Highland Road were developed by Sal Indelicato in 1947. And of course it became the apartment house where graduate students, young professors, and so on lived until they were able to buy their own property. In 1954, the residents of the area here, which had been the Manning farm, out this way, petitioned the Village of Cayuga Heights to become incorporated within the village lines. So this would, now we're getting pretty recent history. I remember when we came to Ithaca in 1958, the paper was full of, was the village going to annex, or was it going to be annexed, was it going to this, how was the water was this, and so on and so forth. So the village accepted this new property, so that at that time, in 1954, the village grew from 0.44 square miles to 1.82 square miles. So at this time, the village still drew its water from the city of Ithaca, and the sewer system also operated within the city of Ithaca. So, so at one point, there was big egos involved in all of this, as you can imagine, and a lot of conflict, as we know now, between the people on the flats or down below and the people up here on the hill. So the question was, would the city annex Cayuga Heights? And I think at that time, this is when Mayor Marcham, Fred Marcham, came on the scene. And he decided that whatever happened, no, they were going to try to establish things on their own, become their own village. So the deal with the city was that they would accept Cayuga Heights, but the village would have to pay $110,000 to the city in order to become annexed and so on like that. So as I said, Marcham led the effort to keep Cayuga Heights, Cayuga Heights is its own entity. But of course, the first thing it had to do was develop a sewer system